Okay, I'll hand it over to Bill now.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I want to welcome David Weinstock to the Suncoast Writers Guild. He's got a great program lined up for us. What Makes Writing Happen, I believe is the name of it. David is a poet, a writer, editor, creative writing teacher, workshop organizer, ghostwriter, and copywriter. I am not half of those things, so good job. And David's from Middlebury, Vermont, where he has run a poetry workshop for 27 years. That's another impressive feat there. Anything else you'd like to say, David, in the way of a welcome and introducing yourself?
Thank you for having me, and I'll be talking about myself for a lot, but this is terrific. Now you mentioned that there you have poets, you have other kinds of writers. Are what's the breakdown on poets and writers, or poets and novelists, or?
Well, I would say that right now we are very well represented with poetry. Many poets are on here. It looks like we have a large crowd, larger than usual. I'm not sure exactly how many have signed up, but I'd say it's about 50-50 right now.
Okay. Well, all right. Ready to go? Can you hear me?
Gotcha. Yeah.
All right. Well, again, thanks especially to Deanna. Deanna's been a member of my Middlebury workshop forever, at least 20 years, and is a very hardworking writer. And I've learned a lot from reading her and talking to her, and I'm glad she has this other group too. I'm going to, in my talk, I'll be reading a few poems by other people and a few poems by me, and one piece of prose by me. But here's what I want to talk about. And as I've thought about it over the past few weeks that I've been trying to figure out exactly what to say, I've changed my mind 6 or 7 times. So here we go. And I want to start by saying that we have chosen a very psychologically and spiritually difficult profession. This is not a hobby. It's not a job. It's a calling. And I want to talk about what called me, what's calling you, and how to use the power of that call to solve the puzzles from the smallest to the largest that come up as we write. And I wanted to start with a poem by a poet, a teacher of mine, Richard Wilbur, that talks about the call that we get as writers. It's called Praise in Summer. Obscurely, yet most surely called to praise, as sometimes summer calls us all, I said, the hills are heavens full of branching ways, where star-nosed moles fly overhead the dead. I said, the trees are mines in air. I said, see how the sparrow burrows in the sky. And then I wondered, why this mad instead perverts our praise to uncreation? Why such savor is in this wrenching things awry? Does sense so stale that it must needs derange the world to know it? To a praiseful eye, should it not be enough of fresh and strange, that trees grow green and moles can course in clay and sparrows sweep the ceiling of our day? From the very first word of the poem, obscurely, you see the problem. Obscurely, yet most surely called to praise. From the very first word, you can see the writer's call, the calling can be quite obscure. It took me a long time to understand it. Who called? Who's calling? Who keeps calling? What exactly do they want me to do? Do I have any choice in the matter? Obscurely, yet most surely, I got the call and I had to answer. It was always true. I never felt or thought or said that I wasn't sure I was called. Writing is a calling, a vocation. That's the opposite of an avocation, which you could call a hobby. And as I said, hoo boy, this is no hobby. This is serious business. For a long time, being called wasn't about job choice in general, but mainly meant to be called to the service of God. In the Bible, you might be called to be a prophet, which is not a bad gig for a poet. Later in history, you'd be called to the ministry or to the priesthood or to the convent or to the pulpit. And who calls? Who's calling? Called by, well, I guess probably God, if you believe in that. In the Bible, that call was not a metaphor. It wasn't a text or an email. It was a personal call, a local call. God himself or herself or a duly appointed angel would show up in your neighborhood behind a bush or at your door and call out your name and tell you what you must do. This is always a surprise and not always a pleasant one. When Moses got that call, he said, "Who, me? Why me? Well, can I do that?" And God said, "Don't worry, I'll be there with you." Of course, not everybody wants to accept that kind of call and the job that goes with it. Jonah quite famously had absolutely no interest in being a prophet, and he skedaddled, got on a boat, and sailed away. You know how that turned out. Eventually, he stopped fighting and he accepted the calling. The calling changes everything. And even if it turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to you, it's not an easy life. Hardly anybody's loving parents ever say, "Honey, when you grow up, you ought to be a writer." And parents who are actually writers themselves are even less likely to say it. We would no more encourage our child to become a writer than to be a shoplifter or the governor of Florida. My two boys, one is a material science engineer, and I'm all for that. But my other son was an English major, and he's a clever and inventive writer. And who knows, he may end up doing that for a living, but not because I told him it was a good idea, because it isn't. The only good enough reason to do it, to live and work as a writer, is because you've been called to it irresistibly. Some combination of your talent, your personality, your education, and your spirit have somehow gotten together and told you, in so many words, this is your work. This is what you must do. You are called. Heed the call. So Richard Wilbur wrote, obscurely, yet most surely called to do what? Called to praise. And that poem was exactly a poem of praise, and also includes a lesson on how to deliver that kind of praise directly and powerfully. And doing that is more important than being hyper clever and inventive. Writing powerfully without over striving for cleverness, that's amazing advice to hear from a poet who was in his 20s when he wrote that. When I was a poet in my 20s, trying to transfer into Wesleyan University, a friend gave Richard Wilbur some of my poems to read, and he praised them to the college admissions department and told them they should let me in right away, and they did. But here's the catch. As a calling, praise is a perfect fit for a lyric poet. But there are other things besides praise that need to be written, that must be written. What are the other calls we must follow? For even if we never know exactly who is calling us, we absolutely must somehow figure out what we are being called to do. So ask yourself, I ask you, invite you to think about, what is your calling as a writer? You may already know, or you may be about to discover it. Very few of us are born knowing. Rachel Carson was trained as a marine biologist and considered herself a poet of the sea. But she was in her 50s before she began to write Silent Spring, warning the world about DDT. And without her, we might not have the environmental movement or the Environmental Protection Agency. Another, a Vermont writer, Bill McKibben, didn't start out to save the world, but his work on climate change has changed everything. His activism grew out of his writing. I asked a friend, Jodi Daynard, how she knew she was called to write historical fiction, like her trilogy, The Midwife's Revolt. And the reason I asked is that I totally don't get it about history. The way some people are about math, I am about history. Maybe one way to discover your calling is by a process of elimination, discovering what you aren't any good at. One day, a college history professor, an otherwise perfectly polite man, told me out loud, and I quote, "David, you will never be a historian." Well, Jodi's answer about historical fiction wasn't really about history at all. It was purely personal. She told me, "I think that setting a story far away from me allows me the illusion of not being connected personally. Many characters are vessels for my feelings about my real world relationships. And there's an intellectual component or driving theme of all my books, and that's the discrepancy between America in beautiful theory and America in fact. I'm commenting on the deep dichotomy of America in dream and in fact. It drives everything I write. Now, I read a lot, I always have, but more than anything else, I reread books that I love. I read them again and again. And when I started thinking about giving this talk, I asked myself, those writers whose books I read over and over again, what were they doing? What call were they following? I can't tell you how many times I've read Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn and J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter books and Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass and Robert Heinlein's Double Star and Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game and poems by John Berryman and Sylvia Plath and Renee Rilke. There was Martin Gardner. Martin Gardner wrote about mathematics, so even a child could understand it, using games and puzzles. And he wrote about physics, about relativity, even about time travel. Again, with perfect clarity. He explained like nobody else could. And because he was such a good explainer, he didn't limit himself to math. The best book you can possibly read about the works of Lewis Carroll is Martin Gardner's book, The Annotated Alice. Lewis Carroll was an Oxford math professor who wrote nearly as many books about math as he did about the fantasy worlds he created. So I can relate to that calling that Martin Gardner and Lewis Carroll both followed. The calling is to explain the world, to write about math and science in non-technical language, to write about science like it was part of real life and even belonged in poetry. One of my first published poems was about geology, or maybe about rock collecting. The difference between rocks and minerals. Rocks are meatloaf, minerals are trout. Rocks are Reader's Digest, minerals are New Yorker. Minerals are girls, rocks are men. Minerals are boys, rocks are women. In my mouth, sandstone is dust, shale is mud, tourmaline is watermelon. The French drink eau minerale. We drink rolling rock. I would rather mineralize than petrify. I would rather sparkle than endure. Magpies trim their nests with minerals. Chickens stuff their gizzards with rocks. Rocks are patient, minerals are brilliant. Minerals are sex, rocks are being pregnant. Discouraged by rocks, the dinosaurs died. Inspired by minerals, cave folk dreamed of God. When I give a reading, I often read that one first because poetry readings, as you know, can be ghastly affairs, dead serious, or just plain dead. A poet reads a serious poem and the audience responds with total silence, perhaps profound silence, but also possibly only polite silence. One person sometimes emits a muffled gasp, but the rule is silence. But now, if a poem is funny, the audience finally does know what to do. They laugh, as naturally as if I'd told a joke instead of a poem. And if you can get over the prejudice that real poetry is serious and funny poetry doesn't count, it finally occurred to me that writing funny poems is an important part of my talent, part of my calling. I'm called to make my readers and listeners laugh. And another thing about that, just this week, a workshop member laughed at my latest poem and said, "Your poems are funny, David. How do you do that? I wish I could do that." And I looked at her and I said, "You're a funny person. You say funny things all the time. You could put that into your poems." And she said, "How?" Well, I promised I would teach her, and I will. And although that particular question never came up before, it's exactly like another thing I have to teach most often: getting a writer to write down the real, live, natural, clear sentences that they say in real life. This comes up a lot in the poetry workshop. And it also comes up when I'm helping somebody who thinks they have writer's block. I take a legal pad and I say, "So you're having writer's block. Just tell me what's the thing you want to say." And they say it out loud. And I write it down and I say, "Okay, what else?" And they say more and I write it down. And after a few rounds of that and they're done, I hand over the pad and I say, "Your writer's block is gone. You just said it all. Type this up." And their first response is always the same thing. "You mean I can just say it? Like say what I mean? Is that like legal?" Now, why do I have to teach so many well-spoken adults that good writing is just writing down good talking? Why do I have to remind them that human beings were speaking for tens of thousands of years before they were writing, that language and storytelling and poetry and song pre-existed high school English classes? Because they think there's a rule against it. They think that writing has to be foofy and formal, that all prose needs to sound like a high school term paper, and that all poems need to sound like William effing Wordsworth. And yes, that's how they used to teach us, and in many places they still do. Now, I know that in this Zoom room full of writers, quite a few of you probably were high school English teachers, or were, and you probably weren't the ones who created this particular problem. Maybe high school English teachers today have finally gotten a clue and don't teach that way anymore, but I remember those textbooks. If you believed what they used to put in the approved anthologies for us, you might, for instance, think that Walt Whitman was primarily a patriotic poet. "Oh, Captain, my Captain," a very respectful poem about Abe Lincoln. Maybe Walt wrote the Star-Spangled Banner too. So you would never guess from the little that they showed us that Walt was a wacky rule breaker, and he was the gayest poet in America, or at least the very gayest poet in New Jersey until Allen Ginsberg came along. Another writer I reread a lot is J.K. Rowling. I read the Harry Potter books to my kids, and I never stopped. What is her calling? One thing I think is the idea that children matter. Children are important. I'm doing a strange project this year, a chapbook collection of poems about knots. See, knots. Don't even ask me how that got started, but part of studying the subject involves watching YouTube videos of people tying knots. Let me just get my speaker phone here. Speaker, okay. All right. I'm not showing up as speaker, am I? Or is that only on my own? That's only on my own screen, right? No, okay. Okay. So I was watching one that explained how to tie a shepherd's sling. That's the slingshot that David uses to defeat Goliath. And here's a poem. Young Shepherd's Sling Song. Every single morning, weeks on end, Goliath, who the Arabs call Yulat, struts up and down the battle line to bellow at us, beckon us, and taunt. The whole thing can be settled, he insists. That's all I need. One round of single fucking combat, man to man. Got anyone who's big enough to win? He's 9'9". That's 8 cubits in a span. I'm barely 5'8", but I am David. In Arabic, Dawood, and I have read the books. Ender Wiggin, Harry Potter, Dorothy Gale, and little Alice Little. And here I have my sling. Sometimes it takes a kid to save the world. Now, I've said that understanding your calling as a writer is a big thing, a huge thing. But day to day, minute to minute, what gets in your way as a writer is usually something smaller, and the right strategy is to make it smaller still. Stuff like, am I using too many adjectives? Should this be a period or a semicolon? Should my narrator be first person singular or third person omniscient? What is my theme? What are my symbols? And when you find yourself asking that kind of question, or when your workshop mates helpfully and kindly ask that kind of question, if those questions are indeed helpful, well, hallelujah. But if they aren't helpful, if they trip you up, stop you in your tracks, make you put the writing aside for a day or 10 years, here's what to do. Remind yourself of your calling, its importance, its urgency, its power. If you're like Rachel Carson or Bill McKibben and your job is to save the world, it's not about punctuation. If you're like Mark Twain, your calling is to help a nation torn apart by civil war to start laughing again. That goal relieves you of the imaginary rule to be dignified and proper. Here's another poem of mine inspired by science. I do this a lot. I'm starting to suspect that it might be one of my callings or my main calling. This is called the Weinstock Variations. And it starts with a quote from a physicist, Victor Weisskopf: "To understand hydrogen is to understand all of physics." 1. Proton. Imagine the creator is a great white chicken. She has laid every egg of existence in the same vast basket. All is made of protons, and protons are made of everything. This is a comfort. Only the bitterest man would begrudge such simplicity and compactness. You have met this man. 2. Onion. Peel, chop, saute with butter. Wait and stir and wait until it is caramel brown. Now you know plenty. Anything can be eaten. 3. Chair. Consider an ordinary chair, sturdy and plain, like in the town library reference room, oak strong and competent. If you can build one, your education is complete. 4. Lawn mower. It is all here to be learned, from the explosion of gasoline, war, from the spinning of blades, democracy, from the fine mist of grass that cascades through the air on your right, parfumerie, from August drought, bleak anguish, from late fall mowing, the pleasures of age. 5. Proton. All in all, from all is all, infinite, complete. Understand, there are no childless women. There is no barren land. This is how we know. As I said, one of my professors told me once I'd never be a historian. And he was right. But at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic in March of 2020, 2 years ago, I wrote a piece of, you could call it future fiction, and it was literally published the next day. And in the time since, it has become historical fiction. It's called The Unboxing. I've never made one of these before, an unboxing video. For a while, everybody was doing them. YouTube was packed with unboxings, and they were quite entertaining. Here's how they go. They start with a shot of a box alone on a table. And inside the box, inside the box, you tell us, we hear your voice, although we never see your face, is something you never really, is something you really, really want, something you're excited about. Maybe you ordered it, it's a new toy, it's a game, a gadget, or it's a gift, but you know what's in the box. You're ready, past ready. You've been longing for it, dreaming about it, and now here it is, and you're going to show it to the world. The video is about you opening the box, slowly, one layer at a time, getting the thing out of the box, reverently, respectfully giving this precious thing its full measure of your appreciation. And although nobody sees your face, they do see your hands. Holding the box, how slowly and lovingly your hands take the thing out one piece at a time, and lay them on the table, and then slowly start to put them together until the thing is complete. All that time you tell us what we're seeing and why you love it. Finally, it's done. You might put in the batteries or plug it in or whatever finishing touch. It's all about touching, but you don't actually turn it on to demonstrate it. That's considered a bit crass. The last shot is always a triumphant close-up of the thing, ready to make you happy, and you tell us how happy you are. When we first heard about coronavirus, it sounded manageable, not too scary, and so far away in China, then Korea, then Japan, then Italy. And even there, it wasn't that bad. I mean, hardly anybody was infected. And only 2% of them were dying, and those were ones already pretty fragile, old, or sick with something else. And coronavirus just finished them off. But things changed fast, and 2% became 3%, and the next day 5%, and when it got to be 10%, the authorities stopped revealing any numbers at all. But we could all guess that hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, were infected. The hospitals were full. The ambulances had nowhere to take you. The masks were sold out. The test kits were used up. The oxygen tanks were empty. The authorities very sensibly recommended self-care and even self-quarantine. Just stay in your room. That's the best thing for yourself, for everyone else. Stay home. Don't spread the virus to the rest of us. Everything was filling up and breaking down, but thank God, thank Google, the internet stayed up. For us, alone in our rooms, for me, alone in my room, that was all we had. We sent each other news and photos and advice, all the ways we knew: email, text, Facebook, Twitter. Then one special friend of mine who lived far away got the virus, and he told me everything. Almost hourly, he sent messages until he could do no more. It broke my heart, but there was nothing I could do. And things kept getting worse. The hospices were full. The authorities started recommending self-hospice, which at first sounded absurd, but they had thought this through and told you exactly how to hospice yourself. Now, here is our video. I will do the unboxing, and you will carry the camera and microphone and record it all. Thank you. We are walking on a broad, sandy beach toward the water. You see, the funeral homes were full. The hearses were full. The cemeteries, the crematoria were full. For that, the helpful authorities had no further advice, but people are creative. So before long, all over the world, after self-care, after self-quarantine, after self-hospice, there came, you guessed it, self-cremation. When it was all over, I went to my special friend's house, which had burned down around him. With me, I brought this box and a broom and dustpan, and I filled the box with ashes I found. Were they his ashes? Probably some of them were. When I had enough, I closed the box and brought it home. And now today, here so all can see, I open it. I walk out into the surf, and here we go, and remember to focus on my hands. I'm scattering the ashes, one handful at a time, until they are all gone, until there is nothing left but this box. Get a good shot of the box. So here's the last poem from Richard Wilbur that talks about the call. And then we can talk, and I'd hear some of you for what you think about the call you have is and what we can do about it. This is Richard Wilbur's poem, Love Calls Us to the Things of This World. And it's the most beautiful poem ever written about laundry on a clothesline. Love calls us to the things of this world. The eyes open to a cry of pulleys, and spirited from sleep, the astonished soul hangs for a moment bodiless and simple as false dawn. Outside the open window, the morning air is all awash with angels. Some are in bed sheets, some are in blouses, some are in smocks, but truly, there they are. Now they are rising together in calm swells of halcyon feeling, filling whatever they wear with the deep joy of their impersonal breathing. Now they are flying in place, conveying the terrible speed of their omnipresence, moving and staying like white water. And now of a sudden they swoon down into so rapt a quiet that nobody seems to be there. The soul shrinks from all that it is about to remember, from the punctual rape of every blessed day, and cries, "Oh, let there be nothing on earth but laundry, nothing but rosy hands in the rising steam, and clear dances done in the sight of heaven." Yet, as the sun acknowledges with a warm look the world's hunks and colors, the soul descends once more in bitter love to accept the waking body, saying now in a changed voice, as the man yawns and rises, "Bring them down from their ruddy gallows. Let there be clean linen for the backs of thieves. Let lovers go fresh and sweet to be undone, and the heaviest nuns walk in a pure floating of dark habits, keeping their difficult balance." We're called to praise. Love calls us to the things of this world. What's calling you? And that's thanks for listening. And let's talk. I'd like to hear from the poets and the writers and what sense that makes to you.
Anybody like to step up and talk about their calling? Or shall I go? All right. I'll talk about my calling. I'm a fairly new member here to the Suncoast Writers Guild, but writing is something that I've always enjoyed doing, and never really had much time. But now that I'm retired, well, I kind of, taking back to what you were talking about earlier, when I told my mother and when I was in high school that I'd like to be a writer, she smiled kindly and said, "Why don't you do that on weekends?" And
Yeah.
so now I've got a lot of weekends to devote to it. And so I have the time, and it's something that I enjoy doing, and I'm going to keep going for it. And what I've learned is that I've got a lot to learn. So, I just want to keep myself in that student mode and see what I can, where it ends up at this point. So that's me to begin with. Anybody else like to talk about their calling? Denise?
Hi, David, I really enjoyed your presentation. It touched me in a very, very deep place. Two things. Part of my history as a writer is that my mother wrote poetry and journalism, and my maternal grandfather, wrote speeches. So in my family, as soon as I started creating little notebooks and stuff as a kid, everyone said, "Aha, she's the next writer." Of course, I rebelled against that. In college, I was like, oh, and all I could picture was working in a newsroom, and I did that in college. I was the associate editor of the college newspaper and all, and the whole process I just kind of hated. At that time, there were no computers, things like that. Everything was done mechanically. And so that was really interesting what you said. Eventually, I went through a few other careers, but they were all related to counseling and the growth of people. And I got a degree in it and did that for a while. But at some point, I always kept coming back to writing. And at first, I made it an avocation, and then it actually became my vocation in my 40s. And I figured out a way to be a writer and get paid. I wrote news releases and things like that. But I also did my own writing. And so most recently, I'm a Quaker by choice. And in the Quaker faith community, if you feel you have a calling from spirit, let's use just that word for now, you can actually request a committee to sit with you and try to discern if this is an authentic, what they call a leading. And I had started writing a series of essays about my family in Trinidad, and I just kept feeling like I had to keep coming back to this story, and so I was doing this in between while I was working as a writer, and someone in my writers group said, you know, I think those essays are really a book, and I had never thought about that as that. I was just exploring things. But that stayed with me. My writer friend kept reading all my essays and said, there's more here, there's more here. And finally, I went to my Quaker meeting and I asked for a clearness committee, which is part of the process. So 4 other writers sat with me from the Quaker meeting and asked me questions about why this project kept coming back to me. And they just helped me think through, is this a true leading? Is this something I can't ignore doing, that I have to find space to do in one way or another? And then I did come to I resisted it because it's like, oh, I've never written a book. Oh my God, that sounds so big. But I kept coming back. I finally came to and they don't tell you the answer, is this a leading or not? That's for you to decide. And if you do think it's a leading, it's also for you to decide if you want to commit to it. Spirit doesn't require any of those things. You have a choice. And so many of the people in the group know about my book project. And it did eventually become a book, but it's also a leading. And most recently, like just a couple of weeks ago, my Quaker meeting in Cambridge, Mass, which is on Zoom now, asked me if I would come back and talk about my leading to write this book, which it hasn't been published yet, but they've read it in unpublished form. So I will once again be returning to the leading and to talk about it now that I'm on the side of I need to take it out in the world. And when I think about the purpose of that book, I think of the Jewish saying, the Tikkun Olam, that I feel I wrote this book to try and heal the world in some way, and to try and talk about racism in some way. So that's a long story about
It's great that you have that community to do that.
Yeah.
That's a leading. I like that word. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Martin. You're muted, Martin.
Now you can hear me. I think there's a tremendous difference between writing and being a writer. And I've written a lot, but I've never really felt that I was a writer. And I'm not sure what the difference is. I don't know. But it's a complicated internal mental thing, I think. And I really admire people that are writers. And I don't think that I ever really fit into that mold somehow or another. It's strange, I guess.
It's again, I'll blame the English teachers for that. If you walk, you're a walker. If you run, you're a runner. If you cook, you're a cook. If you write, why aren't you a writer? Does that mean that a writer is a separate, a magical personage? Why not? I mean, of course,
Yeah.
of course you're a writer.
Yeah. I can see other people, and I can see that they are writers, and somehow I don't make that cut. It's
change the way you look at yourself.
Yeah, I guess it's the way you look at it.
Well, maybe it could be humility, but it could also just be thinking that, I don't know. And I expect you're probably a writer. You should take a vote at the next business meeting. I'll take a vote. That's
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
and there's a difference. Maybe it is the difference between writing in reality and tied to reality and writing fiction. And if you're writing fiction, you're pulling something out of you that interprets yourself and the world. And if you're writing a scientific paper or a book, and that's what I have done, it's a different thing. You're not inventing something, you're creating something, you're interpreting something, but you aren't the artistic part of it. The essence of your soul, so to speak,
Mhm.
is not. You haven't addressed that. You're just you say nice words and you write a good book, but you aren't really a writer.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the things I'm working with now is that, gee, I'd like to be a writer, and I'm experimenting with it and seeing if I can do it, I guess.
If you written academic articles, you probably I've started to get emails the last year from something called academia.edu. They say, "Are you the David Weinstock who wrote this article or that article?" And I never was. It's almost always cancer research or something like that. But some other David Weinstock is out there being a cancer scientist. And I get these every week or so, and I have to say, no, that's not me. But then last week, actually just this week, I got one that said, "Did you write New Poems 1975? And that was the title of my senior thesis at college, which happens, and there's a copy in the college library, and I guess it was scanned and somehow it got online. And this place is calling me and saying, did did you write this?" And I finally got to say, yes, I wrote that. I guess I'm a writer now. It's true that we have a lot of um, what's the word? We have a lot of reluctance to call ourselves by sacred names. And writer, to some of us, it feels like a sacred name you don't apply to yourself. Other people could call you that, but it might seem like hubristic to say I'm a writer. Well, of course you're a writer, but I understand the feeling. Anyway, other callings.
Deanna.
Well, I never considered myself as a writer ever. Just before we moved to Vermont, I did start writing family stories. And when we got to Vermont, I found David's poetry group. I had never written poetry. And it became very clear to me that I liked the idea of poetry because it made my narrative stories about family short and concise. And that's what I was all about, family stories. And were it not for David's group, who I've been in the group for over 23 years, I would not have published the 3 books that I did publish. And so I do feel that I have a calling. It's a very deep feeling within me that I do write this for the generations that come after me so they know what went on in our generation and our life, and particularly for my family members. So everything I learned about poetry practically is from David. And so thank you.
Thank you. Well, I've learned a thing or two from you. Thank you. Deanna's work, your calling was so clear from the beginning because it was family history. And it wasn't just, the Kleins and the Shapiros. It was the Jewish immigrants in New York in those years, and everything about them and you and your mother and your mother's last years, and everything you've written about was, you're not writing, fiction about somebody else. You're writing true history, and history becomes, history is true, and that's a lot of guidance, for you as a poet to know what you're supposed to be writing about and why. And plenty of poets think, I have to write something pretty. Well, that's not enough of an idea to write a good poem. It'll get you a few pretty poems, but you knew what you were writing about, who you were writing about, why you love them. The last set of poems you've written about your brother, as those progressed over this last year. It's, you didn't have to make up a character. You didn't have to make up a family. You had the family to write about it, and that it worked really well. I think, yeah, that's a calling. You got a calling.
Alice has her hand up, David.
Alice.
Alice, you're on mute.
Unmute. Still muted. Can't hear you, Alice. Press your space bar.
Yeah. Oh, Alice has disappeared. So David, while we're waiting for Alice, let me ask you a question. Okay. There is, why do we need to put a label on it? Why can't I just be a person who likes to write as opposed to a writer?
Well, if you have no
Okay.
problem with that and you don't have some novel you've been trying to write for 10 years and can't finish, like me, no problem. But I think the problem comes when you say, I can't call myself a writer, therefore I've got to stop. And that's the thing
Okay.
that I worry about the most. It's not a matter of the word, it's a matter of the work. So
I think I'm unmuted. I
okay.
think
Yes.
Go ahead, Alice.
Yeah.
We hear you.
Okay, first I want to say, David, I've been hearing about you for years from my good friend Deanna, and I'm so happy to see you, meet you. I have another way of looking at what you're calling a calling. I see it as my purpose. I was a psychologist for my whole life, and I started writing what Deanna told me were narrative poems, little story poems about my life and my work. And then maybe 5 years ago, I started writing a memoir about my work as a therapist and my life. And unlike the other person, I very much consider myself a writer. And when my children say it's just a hobby, I wince because it's so much more than a hobby. I live and breathe. And what I care about most is writing about my life. I belong to a writing group that started here in Nantucket. And I'm very fortunate that for COVID, because we've been able to Zoom for 2 years. And we've become a very close family of devoted writers. And I think that my calling and purpose is to really share myself at the most intimate level. So I'm almost so way out there with telling about my personal life and experiences that I think sometimes might be shocking to the people who read them. I could go on, but I just know that I live and breathe to write, and I really wish I didn't have to spend time doing all the mundane chores that I have to do. And I felt that way as a therapist as well. I'm an intellectual snob, and I always want to be thinking in my head about what's going on in front of me. And I love to talk about it. As my friend Deanne knows, I could talk for half of our, more than my share of the conversation. So
Keep
I
talking.
could go on. I could go on, but I think I just wanted to share this with all of you. So it is my calling, but it's more than that. It's my purpose. And I see it as my gift. I'll be the first one to pat myself on the head. I'm very proud.
Mazel tov.
I'm not modest at all.
Sean put up a couple of questions to the chat, and I can answer those, I think. He asks, are memoirs and autobiographies a form of historical fiction? And it's hard to draw the line. They're certainly historical, maybe, but let's say nobody's fact checking your memoir. So they more to the point are they a form of the same thing. They get written for some of the same reasons. The past was important. We can't forget it. We can't afford to forget it. We have to then, so that was one question. There's, I think it's very similar because we don't live in the past. So in order to reconstruct the past, we have to do it from the point of view of someone who's living now. And we were always going to have to do that with our 21st century mind, writing about something else. And you have to, there's going to be stuff you make up. You have to make up conversations because you weren't there with a tape recorder, when you were born 100 years ago. You have to reinvent it. So your invention is that's the job.
Anne?
Well, I feel that I did have a calling. I wrote for purpose when I was a teacher to do plays and that kind of thing, and ditties for people who needed a story for somebody's birthday or so forth. But I didn't really feel like I was a writer until I joined the Suncoast Writers Guild. And the encouragement that I got when I would read my travel stories and people would say, "You took me there," encouraged me to put those stories in a book. But also my medical issues with having an ostomy and working with that community for over 10 years forced me really to put poems and text together to tell people it's okay to have an ostomy. And so that was something that it just came and it had to be done. And this year during COVID, I needed to tell more of that story, which ended up into Cancer to Caring, which talked about diagnosis through support with local, national, and international groups. But I've also been called to do spiritual writing. And as a result of that, I've done presentations for several women's groups and could really feel that poetry affecting other people. So yes, it's been a calling in a lot of different areas, all of which has given me a sense of purpose. And I think Alice is right in that it is a purpose. And the older I get, the more that purpose becomes a reality. So, and I thank you for bringing this up as a calling, because I think I knew that, but to have you say it just gelled for me. So thank you.
And it's important because you had this condition and you can write about it. And there are plenty of people who have that condition and can't write about it, and so you're doing them a huge favor because you're the one who can put it in words. So that's part of the job is to speak for them, you know, and that's one of the things that we do as writers is to say what they would say if they were writers, so, or authors or whatever. Let's see.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Am I on mute? I'm not on mute.
No, you're fine.
As a child, I wasn't lonely. I had a very loving family, but I was the baby and I was left alone in the garden. I'd play and I'd be totally in my head, and I've always been in my head. I'm a romantic, I'm an idealist, and I think I've always found it easier to put pen to paper than to verbalize things, the things I think about, or having my soul that I want to express. I found it much easier to express it on paper than, and there's many things I want to say, so I'm a little unfocused at the moment as to, I've got a novel I've been working on for 20 years and I've only got like 16 chapters done, but I'm determined to finish it. And I write poetry once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly about loving, and I don't understand meanness, and I try and express that.
That's worth doing. Well, good luck with the novel. Mine hasn't gone 20 years yet, but it's been a while.
Harry.
I'm glad to know that I'm driven by a higher purpose to write. I always considered it a compulsive behavior, and I have a higher image of myself now. I'm not just compulsive. The other thing about writing is that for me and for other, and actually my writing other people's stories has been cathartic. And I think like Anne, like you were saying about Anne's writing, she was the voice for many people. I think that we can be cathartic for people, and we can verbalize their emotions when they're maybe not able to say things. So I think that was a revelation to me. And in terms of compulsiveness, I like to play with words. And so that's kind of the compulsiveness. But that driving force also leads me to, every time I write something down, I don't understand what I wrote. So I have to do research. So writing for me is a way of educating myself. It always leads to more research and a need to clarify my thoughts. It's an endless journey.
Yeah, and the compulsion to write can be, it's probably in DSM as a syndrome, but the truth is it's a superpower. If I told you that, Isaac Asimov wrote hundreds of books, and he admitted to being a compulsive writer, but so what? He wrote the books that I wanted to read. So I call it what you want, but being able to sit down and write and not have to stop. Some people would take that pill if there was one.
Well, I'll think of it as a gift from now on.
Good. Oh, good.
In your opinion, when you write, should you write the way you want to write, or should you try to put your writing within a formula?
Gosh, well, you should know the formulas that work. I mean, for poets, a sonnet works. That's not a formula, but it's a form, and mastering it isn't a bad thing. But you also should be willing to break it, because the poets we remember the best are the ones who knew the forms and broke them. So yeah, all the formulas are are changeable. You know, what are the formulas for fiction? Like boy meets girl. Well, now you can write a boy meets boy formula, you know, novel, and there's the formulas have to change. They're a good place to start, but they're not the only rule. Is that, I'm not sure if that's the question you're asking, but what?
Well, I guess what it boils down to is should you be true to yourself, or should you be true to your vision of an art, of something that has to be formulated?
If the rules for writing were strict enough to be a guidance to everyone, I would follow them, but they aren't. You know, there's 1,000 different ways to write a story or a novel or a poem, and you've got to find the one that you know how to do. And you're not trying to write a perfect sonnet, because you're trying to write, if you're writing a love poem, right? The love is the important part of that, not the poem. You know, you write a love poem to fall in love, to get married, to get laid, whatever. The point of it is the love, not the form. If there's a handy form to do that with, great. But that's not the point, because being I mean, some of the writers right now that I respect the most, like Richard Wilbur and Alicia Stallings, are what we call neo-formalists. They came into a world of free verse and they said, that form stuff we've all thrown away wasn't so bad, let's try it. And they bring it back and they revive it. So forms and formulas matter, and there was wisdom in them once, and you can't give up on them, but you can't be bound by them. You can't say, I cannot write any poem that William Wordsworth wouldn't have written. He's dead. You know, you got to write your own poems. And if you find a formula or a form or a format that works, great, but that's not the job any more than it is in architecture or graphic design. You start with what's there, and then you say, but what do I need now for me, for my client, for my heart, my calling? I think that's the answer. Formulas are handy to start with, and then, but you're in charge. You're the writer.
So like if you're an architect, you have certain basic rules in terms of foundations and structures and strengths, and then you also have the artistic element of it, in which you make that structure something different and something that you really care for, and then you put it out there and you see what happens. And sometimes it doesn't go over, and sometimes it makes history, and
Yeah,
it depends. And I guess it really shouldn't matter to you personally, because when you do something like that, a book or a building, you've created something that means something to you, and you hope it means something to other people, but that's not necessary for the actual act of creation itself.
yeah. The library where the Otter Creek poets meet, it has Roman-looking columns out front. And my bank just down the street also has Roman-looking columns out front, because there was a time when to do a serious building in a serious place in New England, you wanted it to look like a Roman temple. Well, we've gotten over that, but there was a time when it had the right feeling, it had the right look. But these things come and go. And now if you wanted to build a building with Roman columns, you'd have to explain it to whoever was paying for it and say, these Roman columns are really important. But are they? You know, I don't know.
Yeah.
It changes. It's a feeling, you know, should sonnets rhyme? Yeah, that works. Should they always rhyme? No, not if you've got a sonnet that's better when it doesn't. So there's room for a lot of change of the old stuff. because our job is not to archive the old stuff, it's to write the new stuff.
Eileen?
I think that's a really good example. In particular, the architecture piece. If we know the rules, once we know them, that's when we can get away with breaking them well. And I think it really works. It took a long time. And I'm not saying everybody needs to go out and get an MFA, but when you try to break all the rules without knowing the rules, it doesn't work for the most part, at least in my experience. So when you have that foundation, and then you can say, oh, the hell with all that, I'm going to write this. And sometimes that works well. So I like the architecture piece in there thrown in, because you don't want your whole building to crumble.
Yeah, you can learn from the past. Yeah. What else? I'm thinking about.
Gloria?
Yes, you were talking about the calling. For myself, I dabbled with writing on and off over the years. Mostly I did like business writing, some technical writing. And then when it came to retirement, I decided that what I really wanted to do was become an artist. So I went out and I bought the art case and I started taking a few night courses in my late 50s. You know, I did the traditional art history, intro to drawing, figure drawing. And then I obtained this new job in Manhattan that had this incredibly long train commute. So that ended my art career right there and then. So at that point, I asked myself, well, what else can I do while I'm on the train? And it was like immediately this thing popped into my head, like, right, you know, okay. So when I finally retired, I finally got to take a coveted art course to see if I was still interested. And partway through the course, I realized, no, I'd rather be writing. And interesting, somewhere along the line, what I thought I would write is not what ended up being what I did write. And then I realized that the purpose of my writing is to entertain. And I thought, well, that's kind of fluff. But then I remembered when I came home really stressed from work, how important it was for me to pick up a book that I was able to just basically fall into and get lost in the story itself. So I said, well, okay, so that is a good purpose, is to help people de-stress and just be entertained and you know, bring them up. So I finally won this prize last year in the Florida Writers Association. And so the next person that asked me, so I said, well, I'm finally a writer, so I'm brave enough to say I'm a writer. So the next person that asked me what I do, I said, I'm a writer. And they immediately just like, went like that and rolled their eyes. So I'm not sure if I'll say it again or not.
Yeah, it's important to how should I say, noticing what books you read the most and that you care about. That's a pretty good, tip. And noticing what sort of stuff you got hired to write. I mean, I wrote the LL Bean catalog. I wrote mutual fund advertising for Fidelity. I wrote the West Marine catalog. You know, poets fit real good into catalog operations, but I don't think of myself as a catalog writer. But it takes some of the same skills, but you wouldn't want to do that forever. But think of the things you love. Think of the things you read that you read again and again and again. So when I say Mark Twain and Martin Gardner, those aren't the top of the literary heap. But I don't want to be Shakespeare. I'd rather be Mark Twain any day, because those are the books that I love and read and read and read. And if I could write Harry Potter, that would be okay too.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Anne.
I just wanted to say, I think that Gloria is right on target with people's responses. And I will say that when I was in India, we were at a panchaya, which is like a community meeting, and we had to introduce ourselves. And there were a lot of teachers in the group. So I thought, well, I'll do something different. And I said, I'm a poet. And every Indian person there clapped because poets have stature there, which I didn't know. So I really felt good. So sometimes you get an attaboy and sometimes you get the rolling eyes.
Okay, well, let's all move to India.
Go ahead, Ginger.
No, I just wanted to say, I mean, I think it is, I like David's comments about don't necessarily want to write like Shakespeare, I'd rather write like Mark Twain, and then Gloria's comments that, you know, her calling is to entertain. And I sort of feel the same way. And I write a lot of humor pieces, but also I've just recently, within the last couple of years, started writing about more historical topics. So I feel like I have a foot in both worlds, and the historical topics are generally about refugees, which has become a modern day topic and probably always has been and will be modern, even though you're writing about it from a historical perspective. So I think you can write all sorts of different things, and sometimes it's for you or your family, and sometimes it's for people you don't know. I hope this doesn't sound egotistical, but I just got a fan letter last night, an email from somebody that I don't really know saying, I found your book on Kindle and I didn't have anything else to read, and it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and I just decided I wanted to read it, and I stayed up, you know, for several hours reading it, and I just wanted to let you know that it was so entertaining, and thank you. And you know, that to me is way better than
Well
being
done.
published in any New York Times or whatever. I just, affecting people, and whether it's just having a good time or whether they've learned something or whatever. So yeah, I'm sort of a compulsive writer myself.
That's great. Fan mail is nice. You know, famous poets are not famous people. So I found that if you email a famous poet, you get an answer. They're not used to it. You know, fan mail. They're anonymous people. Billy Collins came to give a reading here at Middlebury once, and I was sitting in a cafe right next to him and didn't know it was him. Yeah. So I sent a fan letter to a poet the other day, and got a response within minutes because it mattered. It's not like being a Hollywood star.
Right.
It's a more, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just say one more thing about fan mail. So I once wrote to an author who had written, she was German, and she had written about moving to Germany as an American. And anyway, it really touched me because I had sort of had the same path. And so I wrote to her to tell her that, it was so close to my own experience. And she said she wrote back and she said she was really glad to hear that because she wasn't sure. She hadn't had that experience herself. So it was really important to know that she had gotten it right. So I'm a big fan of writing to authors. And you usually have to go through the publisher because you can't get to them directly a lot of times. But, they'll usually get it from the publisher.
Yeah. Poets are even easier to find. So they're on Facebook. Okay, great. Other thoughts?
You got your hand up, Denise? You muted yourself.
I really appreciated what you said about all the different things you've written, and just wanted to share that I made my living and contributed to our family for years, writing news releases for different university departments. And one of the things I loved, I tend to be a long writer, whether it's poetry or nonfiction. My writing is usually a lot of words, a lot of chapters, but to write a press release, it had to usually be 300 to 400 words or less. And I loved the discipline of that. I loved going into my jobs because I had to sit down there. I called it the Zen of writing. If I could convey some meaningful thoughts in 300 words, I really did a good job and my boss would like it. And it was just fun. It was just fun for me. And that was my way of being a working writer for many years. So, you know, I didn't know about catalog writing. That's really sounds like it would be a challenge too, but it was my Zen of writing.
Alice?
Yes, I think I didn't mention what I saw as my purpose and what I write about. I gravitate towards memoir. I want to learn about other people's lives. I'd rather talk to a person than look at the sunset almost. So it's all about people to me. And my writing is to educate. So I do write stories that show who I am as a role model, I'd like to say for mental health. And I show in my stories how I come to understand other people, because this is what I think it's all about, love and being understood. And so what I write is to demonstrate this in my stories and for people to see it. And that is what I do with people, all of my friendships, all of my relationships, is to understand them and have them understand me, because connection is how we survive in this world. That's it.
Well said. Anyone else have a comment they'd like to share? Go ahead, Harry.
I was just thinking about the writing that we do as a group, and how we touch people in different ways. I'm not sure it's always cathartic for the reader, but David, we range from science fiction to romance and healing through horror.
Healing
Which
through
is
heart.
Gloria's specialty, and healing by real healing work, which is what Anne does. So it's very entertaining being a member of this group.
Seems like a very supportive group, and
Go
you know,
ahead.
if you've been in workshops that aren't supportive, it's horrifying. I've seen people like go crying out of the room because either the leader was too harsh, or the other members were competitive or nasty, and I police that pretty hard in the group. But it's important to have somebody, because writers are for the most part introverts and bookworms, and having somebody you can meet and talk to, it's a good part of your life.
Gloria? You're muted, Gloria. Can't hear you.
I noticed in our chat that there is a question from our new member, Sean. Sean, don't be afraid to just hold up your hand if you have a question. It says, does David keep a notepad by his bed to write down the dreams he had last night, or poetry that comes into his head while he's lying there in bed wondering what he'll write that day? And then he said, I miss my calling because my smartphone ain't too bright.
I was talking to a local friend who is a psychoanalyst, and I was asking about dreams. And psychoanalysts put a lot of stock in dreams. And I said to her, I never remember my dreams. And she said, oh, well, put a notebook by your bed and write things down. And I haven't done that yet. But my dreams are never that good. I don't know. But psychoanalysts, if you haven't had a dream, they won't talk to you. So I don't know. but as a source of ideas, yeah. Especially if your dreams are wackier than you are, you say, oh, there's the part of me that doesn't get much attention. So, yeah. Let's see what else. What other questions?
Go ahead, Ann.
I just wanted to say that our Poetry Pod group has really inspired us, because we do a challenge, usually the second Friday of the month. And so we've tried new forms. We sometimes have like food or pets or whatever. So when you sort of in a dry spell, having a something to challenge you really helps you. And I think that our poetry group has been so supportive in not only helping us to improve our writing, but to improve our lives as well. We've been so supportive during all of this COVID. A lot of us have had family or physical issues, and been able to write about that and get the support of other people. So it's been a wonderful avenue for creativity, but also to heal our souls.
Yeah, I would second that. Go ahead, David.
I said you're lucky to have it, to have a group, because not.
Yeah.
I mean, when we came to Middlebury, there happened not to be one. There had been one for a long time, but it had just shut down, and I had to start my own. And one of the things about the group is not just that it's a group of people, but also that it's a deadline. And because our group is every Thursday, you don't even have to remember, is it first or third Thursday or second or fourth Thursday? It's every Thursday. It's like church again. It's you don't have to look it up to see if it's Sunday. And nobody gives deadlines to poets, right? Every other kind of writing I've ever done, working in a newspaper, working in a catalog place, looking at an ad agency, there were deadlines. Nobody gives deadlines to poets, except a workshop. And having the deadline makes the poem happen. Not every poem, not every time, but saying somebody wants to see it on Thursday, I better get it written. That's an important thing about a workshop. And by the way, it's not a newfangled 20th or 21st century thing. Shelley and Keats and Byron and a few other British poets used to meet, every week and drink and give each other challenges and prompts. And some of the poems that we see from them came out of these things that were basically what we would call workshops. So it's been a part of the poetry scene for a long time, of the writing scene for a long time. I think the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein came out of one of those sessions. Was inspired by one of those sessions.
It was.
So, yeah, it's a good thing to have if you don't have it in your life. And now that you can have it without actually going anywhere, that's kind of fun too.
Margaret?
Yes, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and giving us this perspective to think about, sharing your calling and giving us another perspective to look at our own work. It's been very beneficial to me. Thank you. And I'm also obliged to listen. I've liked listening to our members' viewpoints addressing David's ideas, and that's been very worthwhile. And I like to think of you, David, you and Deanna over there in Vermont, working away. And this summer I'll be over in New Hampshire thinking of you and knowing that you're doing good work.
Come
Thank you
visit
for-
sometime.
Thank
Come
you.
visit. Like COVID will be over, winter will be over. Yeah,
I hope so.
Come on to Vermont.
Go ahead, Deanna.
I wanted to piggyback on the idea that Anne presented, that the second Friday of the month, we often have a different form. And by saying that David has given the Vermont workshop, poetry workshop prompts every week, in case we didn't have an idea to write about, he would offer a prompt that was optional. We did publish a couple of books of our work, and one called Maps and Voyages has some of his prompts in it, along with some of our poetry. But we have been pushing him to write a book of prompts because they're so good, and he's got so many of them over the years. So I'd like to reiterate that again, David.
Okay, well, when you're back in town, we'll work on it. I'd like to. I also should finish the damn novel and the chapbook about knots and a few other projects. But you know, some people love prompts. There's people who use them and there's people who don't use them. My response to prompts is always to be contrarian and do the opposite of what the prompt is asked for, but that still gets me a poem. That's the whole point. What I'd like to do, and what our group has never done, I don't know if yours has, is to actually do writing in the session. You know, when I give a prompt, it's ahead of time, but actually to be in the room or on the Zoom with people and say, let's write right now. I don't know if we've ever done that. And when I've tried to do it, people haven't liked the idea. Does your group ever? Does Suncoast? Do you ever actually do writing during the hour of the meeting?
No, we do not. I think we did that once at a workshop, but traditionally, no. Usually come prepared with the work.
We have done that in past years. I'm one of the longtime members now. And it's really a fun thing, and you give everybody the same prompt and you get all different writings. It's fun and it's very interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Why
I've
do
been in a
you
small,
like that, David?
What's that?
Why do you like that?
I like it. Well, because we meet, 50 times a year and I'd like some variety, but also because things get written that way that don't get written any other way. So I wouldn't want it to be the only thing we did, but I've been trying to push the idea and no one seems to like the idea.
I've been in a small group up north that does that. I think it's easier if you don't have as many members doing it. And I think it forces you to write sort of stream of consciousness because, you set the timer, you've got 4 or 5 minutes to write and you're all writing about the same prompt. And it's absolutely amazing what comes out of it. I mean, you can't really make corrections and it's way better than you think it's going to be. And we actually thought about, there were only 3 or 4 of us in the group. We thought about putting them together in a book because with the prompt. Sometimes it was a photograph or something visual, and sometimes it was first line of a book or what. There were different kinds of prompts, but it was always amazing what came out of it. And yeah, I think it's a great thing to do.
It's Anne. Years ago, one of the things we did in the Suncoast Writers Guild, I passed out photographs from magazines, and people took that home and they wrote about it, either prose or poetry, and that was a lot of fun. It was a different kind of prompt.
All right. Well, David, thank you very much. Enjoyed the conversation. You know, it got me to thinking about my after I took my mom's advice and, you know, put the writing aside, went into sales for a long time. And you get eye rolls when you tell people you're a salesman. But I went to a training session at one point, and the guy who was giving the session was just saying, hey, admit it, you are a salesman. You're, you know, that's your chosen profession at this point. You might as well be what you are. And, you know, I went through it and I started telling people proudly, and despite the eye rolls, and my sales went up. And, you know, kind of like a philosophy I'm taking with my writing at this point. And it doesn't matter whether, you know, I'm published or rejected 100 times out of 100. It is what I am, and it is who I am. And I think it's something that this group supports very, very well for each and every one of us. And I feel lucky to be here. Any other comments or questions for David, or before we say sayonara? Well, again, thank you very much. Very well done, very thought-provoking, and appreciate your time today. Before we log off, I did want to remind everybody that Saturday, May 7th is our next program. And we have Laura Perez, Diversity, Inclusion, and Sensitivity. She is a multi-genre author. And if you'd like some more information about her, look at the last issue of Pen Points. There's a website there, and you can see her works and that kind of stuff. That should prove to be a very interesting conversation as well, and hope everybody can make it back for that. Any other comments from anyone?
Thank you, Bill, for hosting, and thank you, David, for coming. It was a wonderful session. We really learned a lot. It was very enjoyable. And take care, everyone, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Stay
Bye-bye.
safe.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.